how is this affecting you? How can we help you? Families, childcare, businesses.
When people feel safe, they're much more likely to show up and to bring their best. And I think we all can.
And so it's about the recovery phase. And a resilient company is one that will bounce back.
Welcome to the Business of. I'm your host, Emma Russo, and this leadership podcast is brought to you by the Australian Graduate School of Management at UNSW Business School. In this episode, we turn our attention to the subject of resilience. It's an essential life skill that has also become an essential leadership skill. The way in which leaders from both public and private sectors have managed the societal and economic challenges of COVID-19 will serve as a case study of resilient leadership for years to come. Australia's capacity to manage the pandemic has challenged many of us. Examining our response to the crisis and its outcomes provides valuable lessons for business leaders on how to shape a culture of resilience within their organisations. We begin this episode by hearing from two strategic thinkers with a wealth of consulting experience in both the public and private sectors. Martin Stewart-Weeks is the Principal of Public Purpose, an advisory practice working at the intersection of government, policy, technology and innovation. And Dr. Tobias, who is founder and managing director of the Strategy Group and Adjunct Professor and Fellow at the AGSM. I also speak with Melanie Fisher, General Manager at Alta Corporate Psychology and Adjunct Faculty at the AGSM. Finally, we'll hear from organisational psychologist Professor Frederik Anseel, Professor of Management and Associate Dean Research at the UNSW Business School. But first, let's hear from Martin Stewart-Weeks and Dr. Tobias. It's fantastic to have the chance to talk to you today, Jeffrey and Martin. In the past few months, we've witnessed some extraordinary acts of leadership from government, and we've seen this at all levels, national, state and local. What's your view of what's going on inside government right now?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And I think we're all getting intrigued by that because I think in one form or another, pretty much every citizen has really been somewhat taken aback, I suspect, by how governments have been responding. At one level, you'd have to say government's doing what it always does in a really good crisis, which is to respond very well and very rapidly. But I think in this one, because it's been so deep and so intense and so unusual, I think we've seen a couple of really significant things emerge. The first is that, as government always should, but doesn't always, it started the conversation about what it should be doing by asking questions about what's happening to people and businesses. So if you like, it's taken a position that says we have to understand how this is impacting this incredible set of circumstances, people and families and communities and businesses. So we start there. So it's an empathy kind of response. And I think most people like that from government. Doesn't always happen. And then the second thing we've seen is an astonishing display, for the most part. We can all perhaps have some quibbles about certain aspects of the response, but an astonishing display of competence under great pressure. A lot of stuff has got done pretty well, very, very quickly. If you put those two things together, an empathy response, starting from, how is this affecting you? How can we help you? Families, childcare, businesses. And then when we find out what is hurting and how we can help, we then do something pretty competently about it. Strangely enough, we think, well, these people know what they're doing. We trust them. That's great. That's exactly what we want. That's kind of what we want in government. And I think that's what's been happening, by and large, for the last 2 or 3 months.
What's different about this is COVID-19 has not only impacted the citizens for which policy is designed, but it's impacted every one of the government people themselves.
Totally.
Their families, they've been in lockdown, they've been working from home, their kids, their relatives, they've had to be on Zoom. And maybe it's their people in government, rather than being we're designing policy for some other entity out there somewhere that we don't really have a connection for, suddenly they're in the middle of this and going, well, what are we? Oh, actually, I'm one of those citizens.
Yeah.
What are we going to do?
Yeah.
And it'll be, history will tell us whether that's a catalyst, but it's an interesting thought where most of the time they're not the beneficiary of the policy or outcome. We've been discussing the three elements, empathy, competence, and trust significantly, and it's been interesting to not only focus on the empathy, but if you look at traditionally, people have felt that government hasn't been able to execute. Everyone said, well, look at this or look at that. The government's touched it; it's going to fail. And in this instance, we've seen the reversal, where again somehow, and history will show us this perhaps. But what's been different? How come government was able to get things up so quickly in a relatively successful way to get the tax office to make all the changes it needed to do? The computer system, didn't collapse when JobKeeper was processed. So what's different here?
Well, I mean, I think partly intensity, and partly, I suspect, an ability to engage the full resources of talent and capability in the government space that I think often doesn't get used because people are playing games around divisions and distinctions and silos and all those other words. I think most of that has been pretty much non-existent this time around. And the truth is, the government and the public sector of this country is a very, very large bunch of people. So when you put the full talent to work, it's amazing what you can get done, which of course raises questions about why we can't do that on a regular basis. We've kind of got ourselves a bit of a dividend here. It's kind of, wow, gee, that's great. We've sort of got money in the bank, if I can put it like that, although clearly the treasurer will tell you we've got no money in the bank. But you get my point. The question is, what can we do about it? Because this is kind of, people quite like this. They like to trust government if it's based on solid evidence that they are taking an empathetic approach and they're being as competent as they possibly can be. People like that. Why the hell would you not want to do that all the time?
I think one question I'm interested to hear your views on is one of the other areas I think Australia government did extremely well was the collaboration between national and state level in particular. We didn't see that, for instance, in other countries. What drove even that to be so strong? I'm
going to be a bit provocative here and suggest that to some extent we saw a collapse of some of our usual federal-state squabbling out of a combination of fear and uncertainty. I just think governments around the country were saying, holy hell, and perhaps words a little bit stronger than that, which I won't use on an AGSM podcast because that would be wrong. But seriously, we've never seen anything like this. We don't know what the hell's going on. And honestly, fear and uncertainty is not a bad place sometimes to get together with other people who are suffering in the same way. So I've got a feeling that the conditions and intensity of this particular crisis broke some of those walls down like instantly, because truly Victoria or New South Wales or South Australia, we're not going to be able to handle this on their own.
Yeah.
Even the big states, we just weren't, and neither was the feds. So to some extent, necessity being the mother of invention, I think it's kind of, oh, well, while we're at it, why don't we actually experiment with this thing called a national cabinet? I don't think anyone had ever heard. Apparently, there is constitutional provision for this thing to operate. It's just that we've never done it, except since, strangely enough, the last war. So everyone said, oh, yeah, while we're at it, we don't really need all these, state-federal borders. Let's do it together. So I think fear and uncertainty would have been at least one driver that would have got us over some of those old squabbles. I don't know whether you...
I agree totally. And I mean, we have short memories, but if we cast our minds back to February, the outlook was dire. I mean, the health professionals, this is going to ravage the country. Health systems aren't going to cope.
It was very scary, truly very scary. I agree.
And it was interesting also from a commercial perspective to look at the collaboration that happened between Woolworths and Coles.
There you go.
Now, that would not happen. Woolworths and Coles would sit down and go, how we get toilet paper to the citizens of the country. Yeah. But they did.
The new national mission, right? The toilet paper mission. There you go. Someone had to do it.
So I think, Martin, you're right. I think, the fact that we were in such a level of stress and almost panic about how are we going to, will we survive this as a country at all, that it broke down the barriers. And I think it also, if you look at the startup world, the startup entrepreneur is in that level of panic all the time.
Yes,
because in 9 months' time, the money's going to run out, the doors get locked, the lights get turned off, all the staff go, and they've just lost all the investors' money. And so the startup entrepreneur is about, we've got to do it now, we've got to experiment, we've got to get on with it, because my business life is going to end.
Yeah.
So you can see that and very often we don't, both in the government world and the corporate world, we don't have that imperative.
No, not that intensely.
Let's have 6 more meetings in the next 6 months, and we'll discuss it. So getting that speed and urgency, and also the ability to say, well, let's experiment, let's do some rapid experimentations,
and then adjust as we go.
Yeah, and what's also interesting is the public was behind it. Do whatever you need to do, just do it. Save us. So they had the groundswell of the public going, just whatever you think best, which is also interesting because that was a big transition from what we thought of government beforehand.
Yeah, totally.
Yes, particularly while the fires were on. Let's touch on then the leadership qualities, because if the public were ready for a leader to step in, and you talk to how quickly they were able to create a response, what are the qualities, what did you see that drove that innovation, particularly in that time frame?
Gosh, that's such a great question. Let's start with the fairly obvious thing. The first thing I think we suddenly found in our leaders, the ones that we admired, not just here but around the world actually, is that they were, by and large, they were telling the truth. They were basically being pretty straightforward and pretty honest. Like, this is pretty tough, guys, And I think what you'll find, I don't know whether you remember the terrific following that Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, gathered globally for a style and a presentation which was pretty much, I presume, in his inimitable New York style, was just laying on a line saying, shit, this is tough. So I think first things first, suddenly, and under the kind of intensity that we witnessed, there wasn't any point prevaricating or trying to play games. You may as well just lay it out here, because, second point, it rapidly became clear, I think, to many government leaders that the only way that we were going to get through this was by activating and mobilising the support, the cooperation and the energy and commitment of millions of people across the country. Government was not going to fix this. There was no program, no service, no agency around that was going to fix this. So all of a sudden, we had to mobilise at a very, very substantial scale. Yes, we had to be honest, but we had to be honest and direct because actually we wanted people's cooperation very quickly. If you want to get, whatever the population is of this country these days, 20-odd million people, to please walk around 1.5 meters away from everybody, and could you please start doing that right now? There's a form of leadership that's involved in getting that cooperation, and you can't bark at people and you can't yell at them. And you've got to start by being bloody honest with them about why you want them to do that, and so on and so forth. So I think there was a substantial lift in a sense of honesty and levelling with us, which I think people really, really responded to. But I think the other point is this sense that people in the leadership level had managed to get a good balance between the need to include lots of people relatively rapidly, get feedback, state premiers, lots of people, and then cut through time to act. So we seem to get a slightly better balance between, we can't have another 6 meetings about this, but we probably have to have 1 or 2. Yes, we're in a hurry, but we also want to maximise the chances of getting this right. So the deliberation versus action balance changed, but I think we got that right. Again, difficult thing for a leader. Under pressure, quick, do something, And yet at the same time, we do have to act, but also we do have to take soundings. We have to be careful that we bring people with us. So those were some of the characteristics I felt were on show over the last few months.
Look, I agree totally. In the time between when COVID-19 started and today, I don't think any of the politicians, and I say this with respect to AGSM, went off and did leadership training, which then suddenly turned them into a leader. I think building on what Martin said, I think it is a real lesson in leadership.
Let me throw, Emma, if I could, just one other thought's occurred to me as we've been speaking, because I think it's another leadership quality that we often forget, and it's going to be very important, in my view, in the public space. I actually think I also work in the corporate sector as well, although Jeffrey does a lot more work in that sector. I think it's true for most large organisations. And that is a word that I would bring into the conversation at this point, which is the word is legibility. If you think about Gladys Berejiklian, Scott Morrison, Jacinda Ardern and Andrew Cuomo, there's one thing that all 4 of them, and they're 4 that are often mentioned as, and leaders of Taiwan, Korea, some great examples. One of the things they did was in every single case, as far as I'm aware, they gave daily, lengthy, honest briefings, press briefings and conversations. Not press conferences, as in, we're here to play games. I'm here for an hour every morning. Gladys was out there at 8:30 every morning, as far as I recall. Yeah. My point about that is it's not just about making sure that people get a sense that stuff's happening. You do need that. People have got to be able to read the situation. They've got to be able to see what you're doing. So I think the notion of legibility, this sense of, it's more almost than just transparency, but a real sense that you're taking people into your confidence a little bit, saying, look, this is what we're doing. Let me explain to you. This is what we're doing with the job seeker. This is what I'm trying to do with the vaccine. It's going to take this long, and I've got these people, and here's the sort of facts and figures.
So it's interesting that you touched on the corporate lessons and the impact of this. And I want to come back to that. But before we move to that, how do we keep this innovation?
It's less about just talking about it, but it's more about doing. And I mean, I can give you, a number of examples. I mean, one of the projects we did was with Safe Work New South Wales and Department of Primary Industry. And that was around quad bike deaths in Australia. So, more people have died on farms in 2016 than have died in the entire construction mining industry. And the reason is that something happens on a farm, the farmer jumps onto their quad bike, drives off to the cow that's jumping over the fence, and the quad bike tips over, and unfortunately there are many deaths. I think we visited 80 farms to actually understand from the farmer's perspective what are the issues that face them and why are so many accidents happening? Because it was very easy for Safe Work New South Wales to send out pamphlets or training material or whatever. And, just one anecdote from that, we were in one farm and the farmer said, look, I get all these leaflets saying safety is important, you should be safe, you have to wear helmets, And he said to us, when it's 3 a.m. in the morning and it's, minus 5 degrees in the farm and the cows push the fence down and I've got to get out in my quad bike, I'm wearing 3 beanies to make sure my ears don't freeze off. I can't fit a helmet on. There's no way. Yes, the leaflet says put on a helmet. I can't wear a helmet.
That's a great story.
So and it's through those sorts of stories that you start to uncover what empathy really means instead of jumping to the solution.
Yeah.
And so we did a lot of work. We then ran ideation workshop, brought in lots of different people. We were very big on cognitive diversity. I think people talk about lots of issues of diversity. Cognitive diversity is really important. And came up with significant recommendations that were enacted. But if we had not actually focused on the empathy bit before coming up with the solutions, we probably would have consulted with 2 or 3 peak bodies who said, well, just send them more leaflets and be done.
Let's look at the environment, brought this positive change that we want to sustain in the public sector. But it also brought amazing change and innovation and opportunity born from fear and all the same things that you touched on in the corporate sector. Where are the learnings from one experience to the other?
So it's really interesting. So over the past 3 or 4 months, we've seen quite a number of changes. So the first wave of change in the corporate sector was we better lay off whole lots of people. Is this business going to survive at all? And as we know, many businesses have shut and have unfortunately permanently shut in the media space, in the restaurant space, in the entertainment space, in the art space. It's been significantly catastrophic. And so if we move to those organisations like the large construction companies or the large banks where they've been able to weather the storm, so to speak, to this point and further, what we've seen is a couple of almost parallel universes. So on the one hand, we've seen many organisations who are focused on cost-cutting, expense. Will we be able to downsize our office space now because people won't be coming to the office? They'll be working remotely. And the smart organisations have been going, how do we innovate right now? So there's one company, I can't mention the name, but they've got what they call Engine 1 and Engine 2. And so half of the organisation is focused on the cost cutting and the uncertainty of what's ahead of us. The other half is focused on how are we now going to drive innovation in as fast a way as possible. One, to be able to build and understand what the post-COVID world is. Yeah. Two, from a commercial perspective, take advantage of opportunities that are there at a cheaper price or distressed organizations to merger, and it sounds a bit, Machiavellian, but I mean, that's just what they're doing. But innovation for the smart companies is definitely on the agenda, because if you look back at the GFC and you look back at history, those organizations that actually embraced innovation and change ultimately did really, really well. Yeah, not all of them, but most of them actually did. So the rest of the industry has been decimated by COVID. However, if you now go to many restaurants, you can now start to see a QR code, right? So you can scan a QR code now. So in many ways, we're already now seeing restaurants saying, well, how are we going to get this? What's this QR code? How are we going to do contactless payments? And if you look at that change that has been forced on them by COVID-19, you then say, well, but the technology was there. So how come? It is a catastrophe to use it. The engine 1 and engine 2 is from the large corporates who realize now is the time to invest in innovation. Now is the time to reskill the team. Now is the time for leaders to learn actively learn, not passively learn, but actively learn from what's happened. And then the smaller players who are going to be driven to change their business model by necessity, because otherwise they're not going to survive.
Taking what you've been observing and discussing over the last weeks, what advice would you give business leaders in leading through a crisis and challenge? And how do you keep them focused on that opportunity moving forward?
Well, I'll just say something very quickly on that, because I think Jeffrey does such a lot of this kind of work with such an interesting array of leaders. In a way, if I take the question, my advice to a leader would be to lead in a way that you should always lead, regardless of whether it's a crisis or not. And that is essentially with the things that we've already spoken about in this conversation. Be open and honest as far as you possibly can. Tell people what the hell's going on. Be legible. Go and listen. Look. Learn, before you lead, look, listen, learn, then lead, but in a way, when you say these things, regular briefings, make sure they get good communication, all that kind of stuff. Make sure the information you give them is trustworthy and sensible. Empathize with them, all that stuff. We've been talking about all these issues. And I say to myself, why is that advice for a crisis? Why the hell isn't that the way you normally deal with your people? The only thing, in a sense, that should happen in a crisis is the rhythms and intensity of that work will change. But if you suddenly find yourself as a leader somehow scrabbling around for a whole different way to lead people because, oh dear, now I've got a crisis, whereas normally I couldn't give a damn about them, you think, well, that's not good. So to some extent, my best advice to them if you're looking for advice about how to lead in a crisis, you're probably asking the wrong question.
It's a very good point. And look, I echo all that Martin has to say, to be honest. I think transparency, I agree, is essential. Sometimes it's not easy. The other asset that leaders can have is situational awareness. Yeah. So being very situationally aware of what's going on at different parts of the ecosystem, what's going on in their organization, being very sensitive to how people feel, what they're talking about, what's happening in the marketplace, what are other people talking about, and then trying to distill all of that down into the vision for how we can take this forward and empathize. Empathy back to the staff, the team, the public, the customers, listening to their customers. That's the other thing that's happened. Significant pivots of organizations just from empathizing with their customers to change. I mean, the company that was in car cleaning, the car cleaning company, they'd come to you to clean your car. He then realized that no one's going to want him to come to clean the car. So what he offered is, I'll give you you bring me your car and I will give you a sanitized car. Right. Then realized that he could actually move into sanitizing buildings and is now establishing a huge business around sanitizing buildings. So the ability to empathize around what is the value proposition now that's different. 2, how do we come up with ideas to make those changes? And 3, experiments. And I think if leaders do that and act it, they probably don't need to do much more because, I'll just finish on this. When I joined Cisco, I joined Cisco I had run my own business for 20 years. When I joined Cisco, when I ran my own business as a managing director, I'd say, let's all jump left. Everyone would jump left. You get to Cisco and you say, let's all jump left. Everyone says, well, we'll think about it. And then someone gave me a good lesson, actually, Kevin Block, you know him. He said, look, leadership is about this. Everyone's got a wagon train, and everyone wants to hitch their wagon to the successful wagon train. And if you as a leader can convince people to unhitch their wagon from the wagon train they're on and hitch it onto yours, then you've succeeded. And I think that's true. There's a lesson in that.
Yeah.
I think having seen how fast we responded in our government and us as leaders in such a short time, right? The fact that you made that so accessible, there's a lot to put to practice, to ask and put to play and take those lessons forward. So thank you very much for your time today.
It's a pleasure.
Thanks. A pleasure. Thank you.
This is The Business of, a podcast looking at what it means to do well and do good in the world of business. Some great perspectives from Martin and Jeffrey there, using those key lenses of empathy, competence and trust to examine the response to the pandemic from all levels of government and the importance of communication has given plenty of food for thought on how they might be applied to business. My next guest plants those key ideas firmly in a business context, tying them to organisational culture. Let's go to my conversation with Melanie Fisher.
Well, I'm very excited to talk to you today, Melanie. I'm curious from your perspective, how do you define a healthy culture?
I'd really highlight the concept of creating a really psychologically safe environment, building that supportive community at work. I think that's really paramount to navigating disruption in an organisation and to developing that agility. And when people feel safe, they're much more likely to show up and to bring their best. And I really firmly believe that you don't just, leave your personal life and everything in the door when you come to work. You need to be able to bring your full self and feel safe and connected in doing that, I think.
And how does that confidence or that safety that they feel build organisation resilience?
In terms of resiliency, it is very much about feeling safe to do that and to create an environment where people are willing to work in a different way or try something new and they still feel supported and connected. So organisations that go the distance rely on their people to be more agile and weather through a storm, so to speak.
So it's interesting. Who keeps the leader resilient then, and how do they build that same feeling?
The answer to that is the leader, and I think this is a two-way process. I always say it's much like your own oxygen mask first. As a leader, if you're not feeling at your best and you're not managing your energy well, it's very unlikely you're going to be able to care for other people. So leadership is much less about directing and managing tasks and the technical aspects of the job. It's very much around managing people's energy, keeping them safe and, having a focus on being well yourself and operating at your optimum, but also noticing when others are not. So we all know that when we're experiencing difficulty and not feeling resilient, it's very hard to pick up on when other people are not going well. So I think resilient leaders manage their energy really well. They focus on self-care. They focus on learning and new ways of doing things. They're also really good at managing their own energy through different tasks. They know when they need to stop and take a break and recharge. I think resilient leadership is not about how much you endure something or persevere. It's about how you stop, reflect and recharge. I think we've seen lots of examples of that recently where people have adapted their working hours, their job roles. They've been asked to step into lots of different ways of doing things, and those that felt empowered and connected and supported and that their leader gave them a clear vision are the ones that really weathered that storm well. So I think, we can't look past having a vision and purpose and meaning and feeling connected as a way to build resilience. And I think the last thing is really that during that time and to build a resilient culture, it's really important to acknowledge our accomplishments and what we've done well. So resilient teams and organisations celebrate success. They reflect back on times of change and look at what went really well and find some way to, even if it's been a really tough journey, to experience positive emotion. So often counterintuitive when we're under stress, but positive emotion is actually what builds our resilience too. So stepping back and doing that is really important.
Melanie, I think that's a really good point, because lots of leaders would have gone through like very challenging periods given COVID-19 and what they would have experienced. What are the positive outcomes by taking those steps and the celebrations and sharing the vulnerability?
Yeah, I think a lot of the outcomes I've seen, working with different organisations is just a new level of connectedness and a new respect for people stepping out of traditional roles into different skill sets. I think we've seen a lot of agility and people have recognised that leaders are recognising their teams that, hey, actually we've got some different skill sets we can harness here. And people in those teams have built their confidence and competence in different roles as well. But I think, one of the really important things we've built is connectivity. And I think we were forced to do that in a lot of ways, that suddenly we're not in the same office together, or we're not able to get on a plane and fly and connect with someone. But we've discovered with that global mobility, there's probably a lot more connections we've made through that virtual world, and paying attention to that and just seeing those opportunities, I think.
It's interesting, right? Because they can't necessarily have the physical connection, but they've adapted different ways to bring that level of intimacy or personalised connection that they may not have previously. What else would you characterise as the big shifts in organisation culture during 2020? What do you think will be taken forward from this?
I think that traditionally still, even though we think in 2020 we've innovated past having to watch what someone's doing all day and micromanage, the reality is the way organisations were structured were still to do that. And we wondered what someone, in the next pod was doing if they weren't at their desk. I have had lots of conversations with leaders recently around, I don't know what my staff are doing at home. How do I know if they're producing what they're supposed to produce? And my answer is always, are they delivering on their deadlines? Are they meeting their objectives? Are you seeing some tangible work? And if the answer is yes, well, then they're producing the way they need to produce. It doesn't really matter whether they're working 7 hours or 5. If they're delivering effectively and they're focused, that's really what we need to focus on. So I think we're moving past having to see people are there and piling more work on top of them if they don't look busy, and we're actually thinking about what our objectives and what we need to achieve. And we've been forced to streamline that whole process during COVID-19. So I think that's been a real benefit, because it's such a challenge for a lot of leaders to step into that.
What else have you felt you've had to adapt or change, or you've seen that you've needed to support that may not have been there before? And what are you imagining you're going to need to deliver moving forward?
I think the whole way that organisations are structured is something that, has been a question around, did we actually need all of these processes and systems in place? Was the bureaucracy of this actually necessary, or have we survived without it? So I think, during a crisis situation or just a process of change, sometimes we don't have the luxury of crossing every T and dotting every I. So I think efficiency is really something that's come to mind, and a lot of leaders have let go of certain processes that they found weren't necessary. And, they've also found that their people might be performing better and connecting better with the vision or the purpose of their role versus all the superlative stuff they were just doing as part of what they did every day, showing up. So I think there's that opportunity. Can we restructure roles? Can we give clearer vision around, what we need delivered, and how do we encourage that learning and diversity in an organisation, because people have been forced to switch into different roles. Now the question is how we retain all of those positive things. I think, we don't want to forget what some of those benefits were and what we've learned through this. So holding on to that knowledge when business as usual returns is going to be, I think, the challenge.
What advice do you give to leaders in taking the lessons from what they've gone through forward, particularly around leadership?
Yeah, I think it's stopping and reflecting really actually taking the time to stop, sit back, reflect, discuss with your teams what really went well during this, what did you enjoy, what were the benefits, rather than just focusing on what didn't work. Because I think when you don't take the time to focus on those opportunities and really navigate through them and, discuss them, missing an even larger opportunity for process change. So I think that's, one of the key things. How do we stop and reflect? And, I think we've struggled for a long time around what are the precursors of high potential. How do we define that in an organisation? Is it particularly personality constructs? Is it IQ? And I think we've really had an opportunity putting the heat on and putting people under pressure to notice who showed up, who remained connected, who, worked out of their skill set, who was just during a difficult time really rewarding to deal with. And I think those are the people perhaps we think of as the future of our organisation, and we put investment into growing and developing them. So it gives us a real chance to put a whole different lens on how we develop our talent in an organisation as well.
I love that you just reflected on the people aspect, who showed up, who turned up, who was adaptive. Is resilience and the ability to sort of build this healthy culture and turn up to deliver your best work, is that something fundamentally learned? Is it innate?
Building a resilient culture is everybody's responsibility. And if you look at the research on organisational culture and resilience versus individual resilience, there's some very common themes. And, when we take resilience as a concept, is there a part of it that's heritable? Well, perhaps we're probably looking in the vicinity of 25 to 40% of our general disposition might lend ourselves to being more resilient. However, what we know from all of the research on not just individual resilience, but resilient organisational cultures, is that it's not a fixed and stable trait. It's not something that, you measure now and you retain for a period of time. It's agile, it's adaptive, and it's something that we need to constantly focus on and build. So we take those learnings and reflect and take them on the next part of the journey and adapt as things move on. So it's a constant process of reflection, taking space to recharge, reset our purpose and vision, and that's on an individual and organisational level.
I'm curious, do you think we've got better at that reflection and learning because we've had to ask so many questions in this period?
Yeah, well, I think, there's a real benefit to not only people's well-being and connection through asking all of those questions that at first we found difficult to ask and found that they were intrusive. But I think, we get used to that and it becomes the new normal, right? And that's how culture's built. So if we, lean into that culture of being inquisitive and challenging and reflecting, well, that we continue to do it. But the key thing is we need to see the benefit in that. So if we're not reflecting that that's been a positive thing, it's very hard when things go back to normal to continue it. So it's a constant process of focusing, I think. But we become more comfortable with time, I guess. The more we ask those uncomfortable questions, the easier it becomes.
Given your great exposure to so many organisations, this is just like, I guess, a smaller data set that I've observed. But I do feel organisations have asked their employees more about how they're feeling and what's required and new ways of working at a frequency and at a rate and depth that they hadn't before. Do you see that something that will continue to grow or sustain?
Gosh, I really hope so. I hope that we've learnt. And I think at first, looking at my trajectory of work, at first the questions I was getting to organisations, can you come and talk to people about how they're going and how they're feeling? And my answer was, well, I can, but what would be better is if I came and talked to your leaders about how to do that, because that's how you build that internal mechanism to do that, and that's how people feel connected. It's great to have someone external come out, but if you can really, embed that process, then you're going to be much, much better off, and you're going to increase that comfort with everything from, having crucial performance conversations to mental health conversations to, a range of other conflicts in the workplace. We've had that opportunity so much recently to really connect, check how people are going, check how their workloads are going, check whether their work is meaningful. And that's all part of building that culture.
I sincerely hope so. And I think you shared so much for leaders to reflect on and take forward. Thank you for your time today on The Business of.
My pleasure, Em. It's been a pleasure being here with you discussing this today.
This podcast is brought to you by the Australian Graduate School of Management at UNSW Business School. There are a number of actionable takeaways from my discussion with Melanie. Her points around vulnerability in leadership, admitting fault, and its connection to fostering a culture of safety within an organisation are something we can learn from and implement. My final guest is organisational psychologist Professor Frederik Anseel. He shares how to build a culture of resilience and its importance in setting direction, motivation and innovation, and also how to avoid common leadership mistakes.
Hi, Frederik. Welcome to The Business of. Really curious about your area of study and what's driven it. And you've just published a book. So can you share your journey that's led to your area of this psychology of innovation and what drives a culture of resilience?
Yes, so indeed, my background is in psychology, and I often have to explain to people that when you're an organizational psychologist, you do not put people on the couch. But so I often compare it more to being like a biologist or an anthropologist, and that you actually go into companies and like you follow a group of monkeys and you sort of immerse yourself among them and you follow them over longer periods of time and you try to study and understand group behavior. And from following these groups of people at work, sometimes we even do experiments or we put people in a scanner to observe their brains, especially when you study innovation and creativity. It helps to understand how the brain is wired. And I always had this sort of an interest in how people bounce back if you have adverse events. Some people bounce back easily and other people really struggle.
What do we mean when we're talking about building a resilient company culture? What are the characteristics? What does it look like?
I think there's a bit of misunderstanding sometimes. What you often have is that business leaders think about being a resilient company is that you can sort of sustain any shock. And that it does not matter what happened in the external environment, that you have sort of hardiness, sort of toughness in the organization, and that you can just keep on going. I don't think that is what resilience is. And resilience means that if something happens, every company will be impacted and probably productivity, performance will suffer. But resilience is after you had the first shock and performance goes down, how does the trajectory afterwards look like? And so it's about the recovery phase. And a resilient company is one that will bounce back. It does not matter if that happens very quickly or over a period of time, but it is about how does that recovery trajectory, how the bouncing back, how does that look like? And do you end up being better than afterwards?
So what are the characteristics of an organization that can bounce back, that faces that challenge and is resilient or gets that as an outcome?
So the characteristics there are about being able to reinvent oneself and at the same time staying the same, right? The culture of a company is how we do things around here. And often it's about implicit rules, implicit norms, and everybody knows like this is how we do business. We do not need to make that explicit every time. Now, if there's a shock, like we're now experiencing a lot of turbulence, these implicit norms are completely disrupted. And resilience is that you sort of reinvent the rules of the game for your company while you keep the deep structure the same. For instance, if your company works around trust, or your company works around taking responsibility or taking initiative, these things should be the same, although everything has changed around you. And so it is reinventing yourself while your DNA remains the same.
So when do you see this not work? Like where do organizations get it wrong?
Some organizations, they want to move too quickly. For instance, what happens, you have like COVID-19, extreme turbulence. Most of the companies do not know how the new normal will look like, and they do not know how they will get out of this. But you have a couple of companies and you have some leaders that are very impatient. They already want to know what the new normal looks like, or they want to impose it on people. And so they will say, look, this is how we will function right now. And this is the best way to do it. But you need to give yourself and you need to give your people some time and space to rediscover and to adapt. And as we go along, things will change. And it is about daring to let go. That it's difficult because a lot of leaders have this, what I call an illusion of control. They think the identity of a leader is I need to be in control at every point in time. And that's the only way that my people will trust me, when I'm in control. And so they want to define how things are being done. But I think resilience, what is needed for resilience in these times is that a leader can safely say, look, I don't know how the future will look like, but I'm confident that we'll find a way to navigate this. And I'm not going to say how the next weeks or months, I can't predict how that will look like, but I know ways to make sure that we'll learn, take stock of things, and then we'll discover new rules of new ways of working.
What should leaders do to build this culture?
That's a very good question, and it can be a disappointing question for some leaders because you need to start very early. And I've been contacted with a lot of companies and with questions, and if I could come in and help them create that culture, but it's very difficult to build that while the crisis is happening. And so typically you would want to create this culture long before anything happens. And for instance, indeed, while you're hiring new people, but also in terms of leadership styles, the sort of role modeling that happens, it is about a constant focus on learning on the one hand. So you need to approach every situation with a sense of, I'm not 100% sure what the solution is, but I'll find out along the way, and we'll build in moments of reflection so that we sort of codify new knowledge.
So you talked about that reflection and I think the time in building this, but what is that significance of that learning, that's creating that psychological safety to learn?
So one of my fields of study is indeed how people learn through reflection. And reflection it's a very difficult beast because we have a bias for action. We like to be in the business, we like to make decisions, and reflection doesn't sound very well because reflections mean that, for instance, once a week you take an hour, 2 hours, and you just sit down, maybe take some notes and look back at the week and say, these are some of the decisions I made. Probably not the best call here. I've learned this along the way. And you need to do that in a very structured, determined way. So, for instance, we did a study during the global financial crisis in the banking sector, and we followed employees and leaders in a large bank going through the crisis. And what we actually found when I talk about this sort of recovery through the crisis is that people that regularly engaged in reflection actually recovered more quickly. But there was one precondition. The reflection needed to be focused on the future. So some people reflect on the past and they always think about the past, and the risk is that you end up ruminating about all the things you've done wrong. What we found is that if people actually reflect while looking forward and being very future focused and systematically reflect on what they've learned and what that means for the future, those were the people that quickly emerged from the crisis and actually had an upward performance trajectory.
So your research around those ways of motivation, like what else does it tell us that links to that resilient culture?
There needs to be belief that you're making progress. So actually people can deal with frustration and disappointment as long as they feel they're heading somewhere and that they feel that they're making progress. And so one of the challenges for a lot of leaders in a crisis is that you keep that focus towards a sort of end goal, that people have a sort of internal compass, that they know, look, we're going through turbulence, we're actually going in all sorts of directions. But as long as the leaders say, look, this is the purpose, this is where we're going with the company. There might be a lot of things happening, but this is ultimately why we're here and why we're making a difference with the company. And as long as you can keep that clear focus, we see that if people feel that they're still making progress towards that purpose, that is something that keeps them very motivated to put in additional effort to come up with new ideas.
So what advice would you give to business leaders to keep their teams engaged in the way that you're saying, but at that crisis point, in the face of a challenge?
One of the things is it's more than words. And so I'm currently sort of developing a couple of workshops around what I call behavioral integrity. And behavioral integrity is about, do you show in your actions, in your decisions, in your behavior as a leader, do you show what you believe in? And I see a lot of leaders writing very nice emails that they're are so impressed by all the work the people are doing, and they are saying we're all in this together, and I understand where you come from and I understand how difficult it is. But the problem is that sometimes during a crisis, it's more than writing nice emails. You need to make the decisions. Sometimes those decisions can hurt yourself. It's difficult to make those, but your employees need to see that you make the actions and make difficult choices that help them move forward. And so that is my invitation to a lot of leaders in this crisis, that while you're strategizing and you're under a lot of pressure to make the right decisions, to think about, how do my employees perceive my actions? How do they perceive my decisions? And are the things I say, the emails I write, are they aligned with my actions? Because now in a crisis, people are looking very closely at what you're saying and what you're doing. And they're very good in a crisis to spot every sort of disconnect between what you're doing and deciding and what you're saying. And so a lot of leaders are now in the spotlight and need to ensure that they walk the talk, right? And that they're doing what they're actually saying.
You talk about micro foundations of organizational success. So these must be aspects all the way through. What do you think are the core foundations? What could leaders take in understanding that micro foundations of organizational success?
So with the micro foundations is sort of understanding the psychology. It's the psychology of how managers work, how people work, and then taking that psychology and the systems you develop. And just one basic example is, for instance, let's look at how a lot of incentive and bonus systems work in companies. For instance, we know that one of the essential recipes for innovation comes from collaboration and information exchange. So new ideas and creativity comes from where ideas clash and new perspectives come together. And that's what you want. You want to have teams where people freely exchange information. But if you look at what incentive and bonus systems often reward, is that individual achievement, individual performance, and actually it often encourages that people sort of protect the information they have because it makes them stronger in the organization. And we know, and we see that in a lot of our research, that knowledge hiding is actually strong in a lot of companies due to bonus system, incentive systems, because people say, I'm sitting on a valuable piece of information, so that enhances my market value. But actually what you want in a company is that information flows freely, because the flow of information is almost the currency of innovation. And so you need to think if all the processes, the management style, and the people that you hire, if that is aligned with all those processes. And that's what I call the micro foundations of organizations, is that understanding everything you do, every sort of management practice, leadership, what you sort of decisions you make, what sort of psychological consequences it has on the behavior of people.
So in terms of practical things a leader can take out of this, what do you think today, given the challenging times, to get towards this culture of innovation and resilience and learning, which I'm hearing thematically there, right? The safety of learning, the culture of sharing and learning. What would you encourage leaders to do?
So I think, especially in this time, if you're sitting together with your team, you probably want to explain to them that your goal is to be better after 6 months, let's say, or 3 months, 6 months, maybe a year. And so you're explaining, look, I know this crisis will hit us in our productivity. It's very difficult to say that as leader. What I've heard most from leaders right now is, how do we maintain our normal level of productivity? It is actually that won't work. You are actually sabotaging your recovery. So actually what you would need to be saying to your team is, look, let's learn. So try to accept that everything what we'll do now with the team, having this remote working, having to reinvent our market, reconnect with our customers, everything will take 20% more time, 20% more effort. Let's accept this. Let's recalibrate with our team how we work together. What are the rules of the game here? And let's just accept that maybe for a while we won't be necessarily as productive as in previous months, but we'll recover. That is the idea. And that will give people first some sense of trust that we know what we're doing, but also I'll need to learn a bit. And so people will not be that hard on themselves, but they'll come into some sort of a learning mode. They will say, okay, it is accepted and I'm trusted that I can learn from this. And I also get some time to do so. And so I think making that message clear and giving a long-term perspective will be a very good start in this period to work with your team.
Frederik, that's amazing. Good advice and great practices and exciting. Where's your research taking you next?
Actually, I'm very interested, and I'm working with a couple of companies to just follow companies and teams throughout that process and see the fluctuations, and then try to identify now what are the teams that recover most quickly. So I'm really excited about that.
Perfect time to see, right? Thank you, Frederik.
Thank you.
The Business of is brought to you by the Australian Graduate School of Management at UNSW Business School. I hope you've enjoyed listening in to my conversations with our guests on this episode of The Business Of. It's interesting to observe the ways our attitudes to resilience have shifted over time. What was historically an idea grounded in stoicism and endurance is now better shaped on principles of empathy and vulnerability at all levels of leadership. For me, it was the point Frederik made concerning motivation that put the realities of our current challenges into perspective. People can deal with frustration and disappointment as long as they feel like they're heading somewhere. As business leaders, I think we can all agree that it is our responsibility to give them that purpose. Talk to you next time on The Business Of. If you've enjoyed this episode of the podcast and want to hear more, search for The Business Of on your favourite podcast app and subscribe.